chapter Numbers 25. But to set the framework for this, there are two sections. I want to take you first in Exodus chapter 34, after the covenant's reestablished. In chapter 34 of Exodus, he makes new tablets, covenants renewed, and he says, and starting in verse 11, "Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Take care, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Ashtarim, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited to eat of his sacrifice, and you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods." So there's a pretty stern reminder then, and that's 38 and a half years before what we're talking about here in Numbers 25. And right after this, and God is making it and establishing a point of saying, don't, take great care in that. Now you have that, and you also, to set this picture, need to take a brief look. And remember last week we talked about Balaam. And Balaam, there were probably 7 oracles where the king said to Balaam, curse these folks. And God, he provokes and shares the word that God put forth. It's all well and good, but as you leave that, you'd think, well, kindly old Balaam, he was just a pawn in the hands of God, and all that money and all that prestige that the king was about to give him, he just truly walked away from. And we read a couple passages about that he would. Except if you look in chapter 31, and we'll get that probably in the next couple of weeks, it's a Midian, and it states this in chapter 31, verse 13. This is, and when the nation came to that point, Moses and Eleazar, the priests, and all the chief of the congregation went to meet with him outside the camp, and Moses was angry with the officers of the army and the commanders of the thousands, the commanders of the hundreds who had come down to service to the war. Moses said to them, "Have you let all the women live? Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incidents of Peor, so that the plague came amongst the congregation of the Lord." So, do not let Balaam get off the hook that he did not provide certain advice to the Moabites. And that sets the framework in the first part of chapter 25. And you have it saying here, and if you think about this, that what we have here and the problem that we're going to see, it's going to have a hook, and it's going to have an effect. And we have introduced here, probably for the first time in clarity, we saw in the first wave of the coming out of Egypt, the children of Israel, after they'd wandered out, not too long after Moses was up on the mountain, and after he didn't come down after 40 days, then they did what? The children of Israel.
Made a calf.
Yeah, they said, here's your gods. They turned away. Now they've gone 40 years, 38 and a half at this point, I think somewhere around that. They've gone at that point, they've wandered in the wilderness, they've been sustained by God, and they're about to do something that we see will plague the nation of Israel as we start to see the history going forward. And they're going to do what? Intermarry. They're going to go in and they're going to deal with idolatry. You'll see it a regular theme as we go forward here, and you go into that. That's that whole point.
Worship.
Right. Now look at this, and let's look at the first section. And we're also going to get it. It's a very, it's a very real and pointed way that they do this, that the Moabites do this. Chapter 25, verse 1. When Israel lived in the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to the Baal of Peor. So you've got here the situation where you've got Baal, and the hook that brought them in was the advice that Balaam gave, which was one of the issues of worshiping Baal was what? Temple prostitution. So they used that, and that's, as we'll see in this chapter, that's what the hook was to bring them in. It wasn't that this was a council of ecumenicity. I'll worship your God, you worship my God. They hooked it more and saying, look at all the side benefits you get from worshiping Baal, which they got. And it was done consciously with the Moabites. How do they undermine this? They said, and think about this. They went last week and they said, there's more of them than there are us. How do we go about them? We can't defeat them in numbers. They defeat them, and they go to defeat them by undermining their worship of Jehovah. That's where they go. So you've got this process and started, and it's the turning of their hearts. And again, this is remember the new. You got the end of the old generation, and very quickly you're going to have the end of the old generation quickly mopped up in this section. But there's also the new generation coming in. And this is a generation that's been worshiping Jehovah for literally decades in the wilderness. This is what they've done. This is who they followed. This is who they've been obedient to. So there's the first thing we take out of this, and we're going to go into 1 Corinthians in a bit and see how Paul uses this. But this is should be a caution to us about the nature, even for God's people, of the fickleness of our own hearts before God. You have here, and it says there in the middle of verse 3, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, and that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. A certain interesting charge for the leaders. God takes the responsibility of leaders seriously. So at this point, the leaders have failed. God makes a charge to Moses. And let's see how Moses responds. Verse 5. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. The theologians writing this have a wonderful time and trying to answer this question. Did Moses obey the command of God? Will's going to give me a no. Why?
Well, the previous verse says, the Lord said unto Moses, take all the heads of the people and hang them high. Mm-hmm. The next verse, it says, Moses said to the judges of Israel, slay every one of the men that were joined unto Baal Peor. Mm-hmm. So, basically Moses is narrowing down the group that God told him, you kill them all, and Moses says, no, just the ones that were, had their faces to the ground before this other God.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting point that you can debate one way or other. One of the reasons that they'll debate this is we're going to look at the census in the middle and see which of the tribes has the largest loss of numbers between the first census and the second. So I put it out, and I'm not sure there's a good answer. I think the one thing that does become interesting is at this point when Moses makes this pronouncement, and we don't get this until a little bit later, but to keep a picture of it, what starts at this point? Okay, you have this. What starts within the camp?
Plague.
Yeah. The plague starts. So you have a picture where the people have failed. They've yoked themselves. Jehovah gives direction. Moses gives some sort of answer. And now you have the next step of the example, which really shows how far this nation has fallen, and especially the leaders. Verse 6. Behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses, in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. So you put that, you have the righteous Israel grieving over what's going on. That's where, by inference, you have there now the plagues going on, and people are literally dying in droves. Through all this, you have this point. And the point that you have, they went in, they brought the Midianite woman, and as we're going to see, what you have is truly there, the Israelite man coming in and trying to establish the same level of degradation for worship before the tent of meeting that they were doing in Baal. This was a point, and remember, this was temple prostitution. So they came back and said, fine, let's do the same thing they're doing over here in front of Jehovah. And think about, that's the ugly nature of what we have here. It is just terrible. So you have now the point in verse 7. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, now, and the debate is, why is it Phinehas? Some will say, well, because the high priest couldn't deal with touching a dead body. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation, took a spear in his hand, went after the man of Israel in the chamber, and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. At that point, the illustration was there, and this was a point where they were probably engaged in sexual act. At that point, he goes and kills them both. And that's the nature of what was going on. You have that. It said, then the plague of the people of Israel was stopped at that point. Nevertheless, those who died in the plague were 24,000. And we're going to go and 24,000, and the time frame of that may not be clear here. We're going to go to 1 Corinthians 10, which is going to show us, and this is Paul writing in 1 Corinthians 10, using this as an example. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul takes this and starts to talk to the church. And he said, this is starting and breaking in at verse 6. Paul says, now these things took place as examples for us, that we may not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up and played. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. A single day. Now, if you want to get into the debates of theologians, which we won't hear, Paul says 23, Moses says 24,000. I'll leave that to someone wiser than myself. What Paul is doing, and adding to us let's use Moses' number, 24,000 people died in one day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they are written down for our instruction, on whom the end has come. Lest everyone thinks that he stands, take heed, lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak to you as sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. So Paul writes and says, here's the application. Idolatry. And he's dealing there in the church in Corinth. They're dealing with what? idolatry. Meat sacrifice, or animals that use the meat that was sacrificed to idols. They're dealing with practical application, and Paul is using this as the same situation, saying there has to be a separation. You must take guard. And Paul then, I think, is very realistic in here, saying there's going to be temptation, there's going to be struggles with this, but God will provide you the strength to come through the struggles. That's what we take from this passage. And even as the children of Israel fell so hard, so quickly, so fast, this was a lesson left for us. But again, it's so poignant, because I think, again, as you prepare and think about this, what they had done, what they had gone through, what they had seen. And almost at first blush, it's easy for them to turn away. So you have, and you have going on with this, the reward to Phinehas, the perpetual priesthood, or the covenant of peace. And the perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for his people of Israel. Then you have the names that were given. And then in verse 19, we got the Lord said to Moses. It's interesting that you have the leader, that one woman that was killed was out of the leadership of, daughter of leadership, out of the leadership of Moab. And the Lord said to Moses, verse 16, harass the Midianites and strike them down, for they have harassed you with their wiles, which they have beguiled you in the matter of Peor, the matter of Cosbi, the son of the daughter of the chief of Midian. Their sister was killed on the day of the plague on account of Peor. So you have this going on. So there's a wonderful thing even that comes out of this as well. I'm going to just duck over into the lesson in Psalm 106. In the Psalm 106, you have kind of in the Psalm the cliff notes, or the spark notes version of wandering in the wilderness. Verse 28 in Psalm 106, it says, then they yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices offered to the dead. They provoked the Lord to anger with their deeds, and a plague broke out among them. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stayed, and that was counted to him as righteousness from generation to generation forever. So you have both the fall of the nation of Israel, but even at that point you have the faithfulness of Phinehas, the leader that goes forth. Now it's interesting, we're about to go into take a quick dose into the census. But I'll give you a foretaste on this. And this is why, some people will argue, did Moses follow God's direction? Some will say that he did, because you have throughout here, and we're going to see in the census, there are ups and downs of small numbers, except for what? For the Simeonites, the tribe of Simeon. The difference in the census between the first census and second census in the tribe of Simeon was 37,100. There's nothing like that in any other of the tribes, that any of the counts, or even among the tribe of Levi. So that's where some will say, well, possibly this was centered around one tribe. Regardless of what it was, we take a lot of examples out of it. The failure of leadership, the point of one righteous man, Phinehas, making that stand for God, and what he does, and what the positive consequences are. But also from even in the nation of Israel, the terrible consequences of sin. So it's kind of a humbling, and we're, as we get into other parts of the history of the nation of Israel, we see some of the raw nature of what goes on as a result of what the challenges they have in coming and taking the land. Chapter 26. That gets us to chapter 26. And it's one of those ones you go, oh goody, we have the census again. Why, let's think, why was it this point that Moses was calling for a census? Think about that.
Could be because it was the end of their time wandering about.
That's the first framework. It was the time, and basically at this point, as we see at the end of chapter 26, we see something. And the end of chapter 26 says this: these were those listed by Moses and Eleazar the priest, who listed the people of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan in Jericho. But among these there was not one of those listed in Moses and Aaron, and by Moses and Aaron the priest, who had listed the people of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord had said to them, "They shall die in the wilderness." Not one of them was left except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. So that's the first framework. The old guard, God's command, he was faithful to that word, and they're ready to go in the land. There are two other reasons why they did a census. Take a look at the first few verses and see what you see in the first 4 verses.
Who's able to go to war?
Yeah, they were getting ready to go and conquer the land. To do that, just so that they had to go and do the census. What's the size of the army that's going to go forth? So that's similar that we've seen that point, 20 and under, to do this. There's one other reason why they're taking a census, and there's a very practical one. As they go into the land, they're going to do what?
Divide it up.
Right. So now you have to divide it up. And to do that, you have to know how many people there are. You're not going to give a large tribe that postage stamp or vice versa. So this becomes a very practical aspect. How do they know how much land and how to divide it up? So you have in verse 52 of this chapter, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Among these the land shall be divided for inheritance according to the number of names. And to a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Every tribe shall be given its inheritance proportion to its list. But the land shall be divided by lot, according to the names of the tribes of their fathers, they shall inherit. The inheritance shall be divided according to lot between the larger and the smaller." So we have part of it, they have to do that, they have to figure it out. And you see by the first statement it says, by number of names. Now if you go through this chapter, you're going to see tribes, and under that you're going to see listed what are called clans. Those of you of Scottish background have clans. My wife is part of a clan. My father-in-law one day going to work decided to tell people he joined the Klan and almost got arrested. He was a camel.
Red tartans, not white sheets.
He was that sort of guy. But there are clans. So you see that larger and smaller going forward. And don't get bogged down. They were basically the names of those subparts of each of those tribes. So in this, you're going to see 5 tribes, and if you would take the time, we're not going to do it here, but to give you a summary of what you find in here. 5 of the tribes have increased in size, or rather 5 have decreased in size. Reuben, Simeon, Gad, Ephraim, and Naphtali. The total being that group has a summary net loss of about 61,020. Again, if you take back the number we had before, they had 37,100 of that was in the tribe of Simeon. You had 7 tribes increase: Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Manasseh, Benjamin, Dan, and Asher. They came up about 59,200. So the net in this, just if you like numbers, a net decrease of 1,820 over 4 years. God did that, and they were ready to go. What tribe wasn't listed in this group? That's exactly right. They don't. But they did get counted, by the way, and there was a net, they increased by about 1,000. So just to let you know on that. The other question you have, and I read it there in that small section in verse 26, it said, this point, it said, but the land shall be divided by lots. And the best I can put to that is that you had the size, you would use the lots, well, some will say that the size of the tribal inheritance within that general area were by the number of clans, and there was that also the point of if there was a debate, you divide it up by lots. So there's a whole, the point is, there's an orderly process that God, through Moses, is setting up how you're going to divide the land. And so you're now, and we're now going into this point where God is getting right here to put all the pieces of the puzzle. How are you going to divide the land? Now we go into chapter 27. You have the first part of this, the daughters of Zelophehad. And you find them listed earlier in the other chapter and what you're going to find, you find that actually in chapter 26. You see verse 33. That Zelophehad had the son of Hepher, and this is under Manasseh, had no sons, but daughters. So you have this point where they're getting ready to divide this over, and you have this, the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, and you had 1, 2, 3, you had 5 of them, stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the chiefs and all the congregation, the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, and now they go back and say, hey, let's talk about our inheritance. There's no sons. What do we do? Why was that? And you think about it, this was there was no ground or no background. How did you divide it up when there's no lineage of men to be able to draw that line? So they make their case, and in verse 5, you see what happens. Moses brought the case before the Lord, because Moses going, yeah, beats me, because there's no, and again, this is a very interesting point, how God deals with that. And he goes, and Moses goes, and God now establishes a whole process there. What comes out of there is another piece where it sets up the line of inheritance that comes out of here. Sons, no sons, goes to daughters. Brothers, paternal uncles, nearest clan or kin is the way that you boil it out. But I think it's something very interesting in a society that is realistically treating women as second-class citizens. God doesn't. So I think that's something that I don't think we should miss at that point of what he establishes. Now the last part of this section that we're going to go to, we spend a little more time at this. And let me take you one other thought here. Why this also has an importance for another reason. I want you to think about later we're in Leviticus, if we go, you've got the principle of the year of Jubilee. And that's in Leviticus 25. And in Leviticus 25, you have it starting in verse 8. You have this section, it's called the Year of the Jubilee. It talks about this. And verse 10, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. Peace shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. There's that whole point where the land comes back to those who originally had it. And there's a whole process again that God establishes there. Verse 13, in the year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. In verses 25 and 26, again, it talks about it again. How do you redeem it? So as he's establishing there back we're seeing in Numbers, the structure of how that land is passed down and how you can see it brought back to the original owners, it becomes very important. But in the midst of that, there's one other thing that God reminds us, and I'll use the time since we're in Leviticus to say this. Verse 23 and 24 in that chapter says this: "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the country you possess you shall allow a redemption of the land." There's that point where we talk and that God has sorted it out, put it by tribes and clans, and put it together, and the Lord has this part of the year of Jubilee, but he reminds them, guess who owns everything? I do. You're stewards. You're sojourners in that. There was that reminder always for those, the children of Israel, that the thing, and think about this, what, in that era, you didn't have a lot of stuff that you owned, but you could take pride in one, hey, I own the land. I own the land. And God says, no, you're a sojourner. I've given that land to you. It is mine that I've granted to you. An interesting thing to remind us of.
John,
Yep, go ahead, Ben.
it's interesting with these daughters when they come to Moses, speaking of their father,
Yep.
they say that he was innocent from the sin of Korah. Because you hear with Korah, the whole congregation came against Moses and Aaron. But
Yep.
obviously there were those, a very small minority, but some didn't. And God recognizes that.
If you look in chapter 26, when they start to divide, and there's actually a point in verse 9 where it goes in the tribe, and then starting at the middle of verse 9, there was the Dathan and Abiram chosen against the congregation to contend against Moses and Aaron in the company of Korah. When they contended against the Lord, and the earth opened its mouth, swallowed them up together with Korah, and the company died. The fire devoured 250 men, and they became a warning. But the sons of Korah did not die. So there's that point, even in the point of unfaithfulness, as you're saying, there are men who did not bow the knee or did not rebel against God. That point of means worship. You get in now the end of chapter 27, and you have the point of succession. And we start in verse 12. The Lord says to Moses, "Go up into the mountain of Abarim and see the land that I have given to the people of Israel. When you have seen it, you shall also be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was, because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin, when the congregation quarreled, failing to uphold me as holy in the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah, Kadesh, and the wilderness of Zin." So now you've got the point of God saying, let's go up in the mountain, get a peek. And this is a similar process in some part to what had happened earlier when because Aaron there's a similar process of declaration. So what you're going to have here, you got the geography here. You're going to see the announcement where God is saying your time is closing. You're going to see the appointment of the successor and the whole process of the appointment. Interestingly enough, take a look. We're in chapter 27 of Numbers. Take your Numbers is chaptered until through verse 36. There's a lot of stuff you have to go through. And what you find in this is Moses, is involved in all the rest of this. So the first thing to understand is that this wasn't one of those Moses who were going up and immediately Joshua's taking over. In fact, you look at the book of Numbers, there's a lack of something in the book of Numbers. You would have nothing in the book of Numbers that reports or documents the death of Moses. You have to go into Deuteronomy to be able to find that. Deuteronomy 34, verses 4 through 8 is where you have documented the death of Moses. So the first thing that you have is that there's a process that God's establishing in this whole point. So you have this, the announcement comes, and what does Moses do? And we'll look in verses 15, starting verse 15. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd." It's an interesting phrase that he uses, that Moses used. Go out before them and come in before them. I read that, part of that is really gives us a reflection of some of the military nature of what Joshua, who's going to be the leader, is going to be charged with. Moses did some very little military leadership during this time in the wilderness. But Moses knows full well that this next step is going to be a significant process. So he prays for that. But he also does something out of his experience, that they may not be as sheep that have no shepherd. Now, it isn't amplified, but I think there's a touching point of Moses looking over the people saying they need a shepherd. They need someone to guide them. So, as a result of that, the Lord says to Moses, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him." So you have the selection of Joshua, and he is described as here a man in whom is the Spirit. And you get in Deuteronomy 34, where this is captured, it is stated there when God responds that he is full of the spirit of wisdom. So we know that this is a man. This has been Moses' right-hand man, is faithful and able assistant for many, many years. He's a wise man. And God sets up this transition in three ways. And he starts with the first one. He says there, "And you shall," lay your hand on him. And then we're going to see that again in verse 23. And this Moses laid his hands on him. If you note there, and that we see that again and again in Scripture of setting someone apart for service. You lay their hands. When we ordain a minister in a presbytery, you see all the other ordained officers come and lay hands. So it's something that when you look at this, it's a symbol that we use even today, of how God is setting this man apart and setting Joshua apart for service. He has that as the first point. Then the second point, he says in verse 19, "Make him stand before Eleazar, the priest, and all the congregation, and you shall commission him in their sight. You shall invest him with some of your authority, that the congregation of the people of Israel may obey." So you've now got this process of transition. You have him stand before all the congregation and before Eleazar the priest. And there's a point where it's a recognition. It's also a point where there's a wonderful transition between the old and the new. It gives some of that. Because again, we know that this is immediately, here he is, he's been voted into office, I'm going taking the pension. Going up on Mount Nebo and seeing this. That's not what goes on. You also see the division of responsibility and that goes in there. You've got Moses and Eleazar, and you're going to have Joshua and Eleazar, and how they go forward. You have this linking of leadership in going in managing. Leadership share it. Now in verse 27, you're going to see a little bit different of what going, because you've got Moses had a unique relationship with God. He was a man who spoke to God regularly. God's telling Moses down in verse 20, actually verse 21, is he, Joshua, shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by the judgment of the Urim before the Lord, and at his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the people of Israel with him, the whole congregation. So you have that linking of how, even that point, of how they're going to have he and Eleazar seeking after God, not necessarily in the same way and same conversive nature that God had, but the use of the Urim. As a sidelight, what that is, Urim were a couple of two-sided blocks. Had one color on one side and one color on the other side. The one color meant one thing. If they came out, both had the same color on A, color B, had mixed colors, you got no answer. Is what they tell me that went on. So you have its leadership shared. So you go on and then it says, Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and before Eleazar the priest and the whole congregation, laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord directed through Moses. So there's that marvelous process that we have established, that the transition and that point of how God and you think about this, how God prepared Joshua for this, for his whole life. And the unique nature and person who Joshua was. He had that link from the past. I mean, you have now three men that were there at the beginning. Moses, he hadn't died yet. Caleb and Joshua. You have three guys that still had the link from the past. And God sees that value of that link from the past, and Joshua had seen all those things and how he's going to lead them. And even in that same language, coming in and going out, he's going to lead them into battle. So you have the shared leadership now that's established between now and the death of Moses. So we now have that process, and between now and the end of the book, we're going to have, as we saw in previous, a number of interesting points on establishing the rules of how to live and how to have that process between now and the end of the book of Numbers. So we'll spend a couple of weeks in there. Any questions or comments?
It's marvelous the way that the authority and the rule in Israel was established when the Lord was the king and ruler of the situation, and there was a bloodless transfer of authority from Moses to Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
And this was under the direct hand of the Lord. And then you look at the pagan nations, how the transfer of power took place. You had emperor in Rome. He became corrupt. A young savior came along and delivered him. He becomes unpopular, and he is slain. And you have the transfer of authority by blood.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the remarkable situation that we've had in this country, where we have the transfer of authority without the shedding of blood. And it's because the people, I think, looked to the scripture and saw a reasonable way of transferring authority.
Good.
This continuity also is a challenge to each one of us. We might ask, who was my Moses and who will be my Joshua?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a sadness at this point in time. We've had all of this time with Moses, and now it's coming to an end. And there is a great sadness about this.
Unique. We've been with Moses a long time through this study, and a unique character in his relationship to God, his point as that representative, as a mediator between a rebellious and stubborn people and a holy and righteous God. So there are amazing things that we've learned and we see out of this. And it won't, truly, your point is right. While Joshua is a great leader, he is not of the same structure, and God is not calling him to do the same things that Moses did. Well, let's close in prayer and then we'll go. Our God, we're grateful for what you put in your word. And we're grateful as we've been able to study this, even as and we recognize the fickle nature of even the hearts of people that have seen your work, as we saw at the beginning of this lesson, how it is we are prone to wander, prone to run away from the God that has saved us and who keeps us. God, we're grateful that we don't stand in this alone, but that by your hand, that you give us a path and a way forward. And we thank you for, as we've seen here, of how you, in our lessons here, show your character in the way that you've numbered the people, the way you've divided it with clans, and even in this point of transition from Moses to Joshua. So many pictures that we can take out of this. Feed us from your word, we ask, and prepare us now for your worship. In Christ's name.
Yes, yes.